Most of my research focuses on the intersection between live experience and emerging technologies. So sometimes often with recorded media, with real-time graphics, things like that, but typically looking at what are the critical technologies of our society in a given moment, looking maybe 2 to 3 to 5 years forward, and how we experiment with incorporating them into live experiences. And so what I wanted to kind of talk about today was give you a bit of an introduction to the work that we do, and talk a little bit about a gap that exists between the national R&D ecosystem. So this is National Science Foundation, NIH, industry funding, the sort of military research funding that has historically powered a lot of innovation in the country, supported graduate research, and the creative sector, and sort of offer some examples of what we might do together, some takeaways from the process of research that we've had so far. And so this is, of course, I think triggered by, or at least more prevalent for us, in the seismic shift that we are facing in the creative fields, or sense coming from artificial intelligence, but has really been sort of due to a series of innovations that we've been working with since the advent of digital media. And so the sort of thesis that I wanted to offer is that the future of creativity is not really a side quest, or shouldn't be, for the innovation ecosystem in the country. And so the backdrop, of course, for this is the economic and sort of soft power importance of the creative sector, particularly in California, but really all across the US, and this kind of seismic shift that I mentioned, and that we are missing a connection between that work and the creative sector. And I say this having done NSF and supported research for 20 years now, oftentimes motivated by particular technical requirements, particular large-scale technical problems, and trying to find a way to connect it to a strategy that we've been developing, trying to work through on the north end of campus here in the arts, that integrates artistic production with research. And so I'm in the School of Theater, Film, and Television. We're a professional school. We train students in theater, in film and television, on all of the things that happen in production. My sort of side quest, I guess, for the last 20 or so years has been to try to enable technology research integrated with professional training in production. And so that has taken many different forms over the years, and so I wanted to give you a few examples and kind of some of the things that we've been learning through that process, and suggest some takeaways about the process, some opportunities that we may have to look at in innovation in the future. So this image is a set of student designs and a immersive workshop in one of our theaters, looking back in 2018 at kind of post-Google Glass augmented reality, but pre-Snap and Meta experimentations in that area, about the audience collaboration in problem solving within a supernatural world in which a story was also being told, right? And so this was an opportunity for students to do technology development drawn from the gaming disciplines, story development, design, and put them together into a context where the audience is having a new type of experience. A little bit later on, an example of another project that targeted a couple of pre-commercial technologies was a theater production called Entropy Bound that it was a comedy about a lead character who had lost her ability to form short-term memories. She had an implant that was kind of telling her what to do based on an old version of her social media profiles. Sort of comedy ensued. But the way that was implemented was through a pre-ChatGPT software system that took inputs that were observed by things carried by the actor about previous performances, about audiences that had come, things that had happened, and adapted the script dynamically based on what was happening in the context of the performance. And so this is a very, at the time, sort of strange, out there experiment to look at how to write story and code in parallel. That also, though, now that we're thinking about LLMs being involved in the creation of audience experiences, seems like there's a lot that we learned that we can apply and sort of think about as we move forward and face the technologies that we're looking at now. It also happened to include, and these are the images at the bottom, a sort of network substrate, a networking technology that had just been introduced and funded by NSF over about what ended up being about 10 years to look at a future internet technology that was more trustworthy, sort of more reliable, more easily decentralized, than the current internet stack. And this show used those protocols to implement the way that data was moved around through the systems. Huge lift, one that was sort of challenging, frustrating, interesting all at the same time, but gave us a lot of implementation experience that then fed into the future commercialization and exploration of those technologies. At DARPA, I was not involved in the DARPA part, but sort of the pieces of that experience got pulled out into that and some of the startups that had worked with that technology. So that was an implementation-heavy creative technology project where we used production to drive innovative research questions. We have often, too, in this particular arena, simulated those same types of experiences. So this was another augmented reality project, again, many years ago, looking at live action role-playing. On the left, you see human beings playing the role, essentially, of what we might do with AI or LLMs today, and providing dynamic dialogue to the players and actions for these players to take on the right in this project at YouTube Space LA. So this was an industry collaboration, looking again at the future of storytelling, integrating a set of technologies that we're still looking at, of course, for things like industrial automation, for support of workflow, factory floor processes, things like that. Actually doing it out in the field with audiences now many years before in that particular context. And so these projects all involve a large number of students iterating together on a mix of creative and technical problems over often a year and a half or so to go from concept to technical development to iterative testing to then trying something out with a public audience. This was the final AR project in that series of works. This was right kind of at the end of the pandemic. It was an augmented reality immersive theater project set in the world of The Man in the High Castle, the Amazon Studios streaming series, in which the question that was posed creatively by the students and the team that was involved was, what if the audience and the characters shared a window into an alternative, a sort of alternative timeline for their lives? And that was what drove the drama forward. So what you're seeing on the bottom left is an example of an audience view into a live performance that also had an augmented reality component with the same characters in a different timeline. I can't go through all the story details now. And so, you know, what had to be developed was, how do the spatial overlays work? How do you find narrative set points to move the audience through? What are the types of designs that work in the physical world and carry over into the virtual world? And this was all, and in fact, we were even looking at volumetric production. COVID sort of shut that process down. But this was a sort of detailed technical and design development process for students that came from all across campus and from different disciplines. And so it's an example of a project that had, you know, what I would call considerable complexity of implementation, interesting sort of challenges, and an audience. And I think that's been an interesting and sort of, it seems obvious maybe for us and maybe for you too, but maybe not in the context of computer science research, to take what's being developed as a demonstration and put it on stage over and over and over again. So this was a project that's much more recent. An immersive disco musical, the musical Xanadu, set on the stage of one of our largest theater here on campus. That was also an AI research project. And what it looked at really was ways of transforming input from the audience at different moments in the musical. These are sort of gestural sketches that the audience created together on large LED panels, and turn those into elements of the digital set and create echoes of the audience within this real-time virtual world from a cloud-based AI process that was implemented with sort of reasonably state-of-the-art things at the time, with help from a number of different groups across campus to pull that into something that had to work, you know, for 75 people on stage every night over the course of a couple of weeks, from which we learn an awful lot, right? And get to see not only what was the audience kind of creating, what did the scribbles become, but what is the architecture for a research project that's overlaid with a significant creative production project. And so that effort, of course, we want to follow up on. We had industry reactions to the approach. And for example, one of the follow-ups is a project supported by Qualcomm that's looking at moving the AI processes that were in the cloud to individual devices, to the audience's smartphones and the neural processors that exist there, so that you could scale to larger and larger audiences, potentially decentralize the way that the AI is deployed. All these sort of interesting technical challenges that are, give us a chance to also do some kind of new, fundamentally new experience. We're running a small class with a research group and a kind of emergent transmedia studio called Immortal, looking at what those experiences might look like. So a couple of takeaways, and then maybe one direction, and happy to talk about where we're headed and how it might connect to areas of interest in the audience. Probably the biggest takeaway that we have right now is the change that's happening in who can code. And so back in 2015, we convinced Google to fund essentially research and production in this area. How do you write story and code at the same time? How do these processes for creating new experiences unfold software development and narrative development at the same time? And it seemed, I think, even to me, kind of arguing for it, one that was hard to get their attention, felt esoteric, and now is something that we are immediately confronting as we have tools that allow us to code in natural language and potentially to be writing in natural language, coding in natural language, even with all the challenges that come along with that. So these questions are ones that we've been asking for some time. This has been a big takeaway. I think now we are looking through, for example, this recent cross-campus hackathon at what is the analogy for that in visual coding, in creative coding, and in real-time media, and attracting, I think, a number of interest from students in cognitive science, in engineering, in theater, film and television, and design, into hands-on projects that explore those things in the same way. So few process takeaways. I think when I had talked with Amir initially about this, the idea was to kind of share things that have been helpful for us in these processes. And so we work with big groups of students. Probably the biggest is the one with Francis Ford Coppola on the corner. 200 people over 6 weeks with Coppola on stage looking at a new way of making what he called live cinema at the time. And from these, some takeaways in technology research and in the arts that have been helpful for me is this idea of looking at code and story in parallel. Pretty straightforward now, I think. The idea that the technologies that we are encouraging students and faculty to imagine and design are focused on rehearsal and iteration rather than on the final product. And that this has been a fundamental sort of realization and one that's incredibly hard to fund, particularly in a scenario where we're going creative project by creative project. We need to get an outcome for a sponsor, and that outcome looks a lot, usually like a production of some sort. But the most sort of fundamental thing that has been beneficial for us is to imagine how do we get new types of creativity into the rehearsal process. Sort of similarly and related to that is looking at how do you build capabilities over moments. And I'll explain what a partie is in a second. But this idea of designing for actors, musicians, designers, audience members, something that might be akin to an instrument that you play rather than a moment that you're trying to achieve on stage. Those moments might come later. A partie, I can't see anybody. Does anybody know what a partie is from architecture? So a partie is sort of this idea of a big decision, a big design decision. There's a Simpsons cartoon where Frank Gehry crumples up a piece of paper and puts it down on the table, and they build a building sort of that looks like that piece of paper. And that's sort of like, it's a funny take on it, but it's a partie. It's like a big decision about the form of the building. And so what we found is these big decisions early on that are kind of creative grounding moments that, okay, the device that you're working on is a portal into an alternative timeline, and then go, right? That's the big decision that's been made. Those are really helpful in working across disciplines. If you're involved in technology development here, the last one probably is familiar. This idea that these processes are sort of best worked through in end-to-end iterations. I'm not gonna say agile design anymore, but sort of the idea of end-to-end execution of a creative product for an audience in a playtest or something like that, rather than thinking of it as a very long waterfall design of this step and then this step and then this step and then this step. These things are not particularly surprising. But I think the one that I wanted to end with and that sort of inspired the title was also from architecture. And the idea that innovation can emerge from expression or a desire to express something rather than a problem statement all the time. So I'm currently trying to work through this as we look at government support for the creative sector and technology innovation, and they really want us to move, of course, towards expressing expressing technology problem statements, which is great, and we will do that. But at the same time, a violin was not designed around a problem statement. It was designed around a sort of desire to express in a certain way. And so I'll kind of end with that trajectory that we're on about thinking about this experience of doing research at the intersection of technology and creativity and where we're headed and sort of where the original description for this talk landed. So we've been looking at also the translation of this type of experience and the work that many other people across the country are doing into something that is more closely connected with the innovation ecosystem. The parts of both government, industry, and private and philanthropic funding that are kind of turning the flywheel of innovation in fields like those that are featured here. And the proposal was, for the global competitiveness of the creative industry, the workforce development that we need, particularly in California, and the fundamental opportunities for discovery, we need to be moving forward the creative industries very broadly in a similar way. And so this project finished just at the tail end of 2024. We funded 7 workshops across the country in 7 different states, all looking at this question of creativity and technology as a sort of engine for economic development and innovation at a regional level. And then brought folks actually here to a national convening to figure out how does that translate into large-scale research support? How do we kind of address those the economic importance of the sector and also the opportunities for kind of continuing the influence that has supported and allowed many different sectors to grow here. And so just some takeaways from that process that we're still now in the middle of thinking how to move forward in California is that government investment can do in the creative sector and in the intersection of the creative and technology sector, what it does elsewhere, and de-risk the participation of industry in longer-term concerns in doing some, maybe not always all, but some research that's quite open and looking at how to initiate and fund tech transfer. The finding, I think, that resonates with the work that we've done here is that we rarely have computer science, engineering, other engineering fields that are closely integrated with professional production at sort of its highest level. And there are some really interesting opportunities that we're hoping will make that possible. And then finally, different models for tech transfer that are not all seeking VC level, kind of VC required ROIs, but give us different perspectives on funding projects that are maybe developing a creative production and a sort of technology idea at the same time. And the sort of takeaway is that there's more than a side quest here, right, that's available to the innovation ecosystems that run in parallel with the ones that are featured at this conference. And being a public university, we have an opportunity for those to be pursued also in the public interest and to look at the future of creativity in that sense. So I just caught the end of Gigi's talk, but it sounds, maybe there are some complementary threads, and I'd be happy to talk about either the research we're doing or the findings or potential connections to what everyone here is up to, though I cannot quite see you. So thanks.
Thank you for your talk. Given that this is the Bioscience Day of the LABEST, I'm really curious of the overlap between your work and kind of the creative aspects and storytelling and kind of writing the story with feedback from the audience with the bioscience sector. When you say that those major decisions, to me, that's like, do you go into the therapeutic route or a wellness product, right? Like, how do you guide kind of the issue away from the problem statement, like we're solving for this disease, to like what does the audience want? Like what are the patients looking for? And how would you see incorporating some of the methods you use into kind of that question?
That's a good question, and I realize that a nice sort of separately a technology connection that we can make is also there's lots of interest in evolution of materials that are serving fashion, costume design, fabrication that head into the biomaterials area. But in terms of that kind of visioning process, something that I think has been is helpful for students are sort of two or three things. One is we try to get them to read a lot, right? And look at what are stories that are being told right now that people are connecting to, and what are maybe disconnects between the story as it's written down and the experience that you want to create as somebody living as a 20-year-old today, surrounded by or trying to step away from technology. So it's a little bit of a intersection of those classical things that they are reading, whether they're contemporary or not. They're reading in classical forms from their lived experience and using that as a beginning of a brainstorming process. A second, is about the affordances of the individual technologies, where I think part of what is maybe a default academic perspective on a technology is to look at its fundamental capability versus where it has headed immediately in commercialization, right? And so a lot of what we get traditionally in the entertainment industry or in the arts are technologies after they've been baked and often driven maybe by consumer entertainment or a different area, and trying to step back and look at what are the fundamental capabilities that we're interested in. So in the augmented reality case, this idea of a sort of real-time overlay feels very basic, but once you take a step back and think about the different things that overlay could incorporate, how it might relate to, again, the types of stories that your team or your student or faculty member is gravitating to, that becomes interesting. And instead of starting with, Meta offered this API to do this, saying this is how we think that technology could be used. So I think that's a sort of second strategy, which is more, probably akin to basic science perspective. Like, what are some of the fundamental things that are being invented? What are their affordances before they become commercialized? And could we play with or push those affordances in a way that's driven by the needs of a particular creative perspective? So I don't know if that answered a little bit, but those are some of the ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. Jeff, over here. Hi.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So I think today or yesterday, Meta announced that they are laying off 8,000 people because of AI. They're blaming AI. Yeah. How do you see, and there's a lot of nervousness in your industry in film and TV over the use of AI. How do you see the future of storytelling, creative works, with AI?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I did not ever think I would be able to say. I'm old enough that I remember the digital media transition as well, right? And it was a similar, I think, maybe different in the scale that people are thinking about it, but sort of similar set of reactions at the time. I guess the distinction that I would draw, which doesn't get entirely at the workforce challenges, is that and this goes to the last question, the immediate reaction in industry seems to be, for very natural reasons, how do we use this technology to automate what we already make and do it more efficiently, which is just the way that industry is driven to work. I think our perspective, my perspective at least, is there's a fundamental change to the way that we interact with computers and the way that we interact with digital systems, and that's going to change the way that we create. And so our angle or direction is less about automating the making of things that we already do and kind of looking ahead to what the new possibilities are. And I'm less convinced that those things pose the same labor challenges. But what we don't have, part of the reason for this sort of investment in an innovation ecosystem that we're proposing is the opportunity for people in current creative fields to work outside of their existing commercial pipelines, right? What they have to develop. So you have people that their livelihoods is to develop. They may be very broadly creative and have many different skills, but the commercial possibilities that they have been, limited into a few distribution formats typically. So I guess that's how I am quite interested in the idea that new forms of creative expression are going to emerge that don't look like the traditional ones. And I'm hoping that there can be some investment in getting people up to speed, engaged, thinking about what those are. So I don't know if that gets at the question that you were asking or not, but yeah. I think.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talk. I just have a couple questions in terms of like creative expression and also technology. So with creative expression, how have you taken into consideration accessibility in terms of like your performances and also representation? For example, the stage is a place where you can represent multiple identities, and here you choose to represent the intersection of AI and performance, right? Have you incorporated like minority perspectives and also, yeah.
Yeah, those are great questions. So typically, very much so. In the accessibility case, what we have tried to do is, for each production or each experiment, right, is look at multiple ways of experiencing the same thing and trying to see accessibility as actually a component of audience choice that it can exist anyway. There, I think, often are limitations about how much technology we can develop in what different varieties, but I think a lot of the strategy has been to try to imagine different sort of valuable audience experiences. So in the case of the roller disco musical, right, there was a version where you can get up and dance, or you can sit, or you can draw, or not, and kind of thinking about the audience experience as being equally sort of supported and valuable in each case. Sometimes, and we sort of think about this in our theater productions anyway, and where we can kind of incorporate those accessibility considerations. It's harder in like limited budget technology development, but it's definitely on our minds in the whole experience. As far as representation, I think that's something that's very important to students and faculty and these teams. And a lot of, the Man in the High Castle project in particular was looking at how you have multiple points of view on the same set of events from different perspectives, and placing the audience in a decision-making place where they had to understand that maybe there are different ways to have seen the thing that just happened, and certainly different representations of expressed in the characters that are there. So yeah, it's definitely a big part of it. I think one of the sort of intriguing things about both the way that we're thinking about machine learning and augmented reality is this idea of sort of synthesis or overlays of multiple differing perspectives that are kind of crafted into the audience experience.
That's awesome. I also have a follow-up question. You talked about multiple perspectives and alternate realities. I was wondering if you've played around with like kind of a dialectical approach to time and also technology as well, as we've like changed a lot from what was technology like back in the 20th century to now.
Yeah, could you elaborate on kind of what you mean by dialectical, just so I don't?
Yeah, like, so what is like machine learning back then versus now? And is your focus primarily on AI as like an emerging sector, or more in terms of what you can create with like audience members?
Okay. To be honest, I don't know that there's been a lot of dialogue in these projects between the technology of like the last few decades, right? It's sort of usually we're kind of taking those things into account, but not explicitly. I think what there has been is sort of thinking about the types of human technologies involved in theater, film production, other types of creative experiences, and what the dialogue is between AI and them. So there was a paper that I flashed up somewhere, I think, in that disco musical project that was a paper at NeurIPS, the AI conference, looking at AI as sort of servicing or supporting the audience as participants in a ritual of some sort, right? And looking at the history of performance as something that we step in and out of characters all the time. Like, we actually operate on many different levels when we're in a performance, particularly when we're asked to participate. And so I think there is a dialogue between those like historical theatrical techniques, when we were doing filmmaking related projects, conventional filmmaking techniques, and the new, different, changed opportunities with a given technology. So yeah, I think it's there. I wish we had a little more of the luxury to like interrogate the last few decades, but it hasn't been as common.
Hi, my name is Chloe, and my background is architecture, interior designer, and video game I feel like it's a full life circle hearing what you're talking about. And I've been in XR and AI industry for a while. Video game is what we call a ninth art. And what you are really developing is more than ninth art. You're implying AI, cognitive, neuroscience really into it. And I would really want to learn more about how you work with AI on the specific idea on collecting in real-time data and on the subject on how to write a story, because this could be a game changer for the entertainment industry. And I have clients that are working on AI-based produced film. And I remember Dr. Johnson was mentioning, and everyone has been knowing that AI has hallucination and also the fixated data. So how do you work with that in terms of working on the how to write a story?
Yeah, I think so the things that we have done most recently have been things that accommodate hallucination, right? That in a way are not so much looking at how do we use AI to write a story as how do we get it to, if you think of like a story for performance as a score, that of the way that the performance might unfold, how do we incorporate echoes of the audience into that score so they hear or see or get a sense of participation themselves? And so that I would say is like whether it's done in terms of visuals or text or audio or it seems to accommodate the fuzziness of what it means to use AI and in participation. I don't know. I mean, I think we have some ideas that are, and we've used kind of frameworks of absurdity, like the earlier projects that we're using, let's say the pre-ChatGPT, pre-GPT-2 types of machine learning or language models. We're really looking at structures that were drawing from absurdist work or drawing from theater that could accommodate things that did not feel representational or natural. I think going forward, the thing we will probably be trying next is a sort of agentic model where there are agent is just a word for autonomous process, right? But nothing special. But this sort of idea of agents that are operating at one level to interact with audience members, whether they're aware of it or it's just sort of supervising their input into the production, and then additional levels of sort of supervisory agents at different levels of hierarchy that are looking at kind of coherence in the show. And I still think the choices that we're thinking of like accommodate the errors and problems and hallucinations and delays and things like that, is that we just try to, rather than, again, I guess to go to the earlier question that Amir had asked, like rather than replacing an existing form, we're thinking about new forms or things that can accommodate the variability. But yeah.
I think
we have not done much with headsets lately. We found phones were much more resilient and cheaper and had better battery life and heat and all kinds of things. I think we have some headset-based projects that we're thinking about. They seem very hard to scale up for audiences. But if you know anybody that has 100 headsets, yeah. Sure. Yeah. All right.
I think we have time for one more, if that's okay with you, Jeff.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for your talk. Elaine from Anderson. You were talking about the change in funder priorities, and I think a lot of people who've done research have had an R&R or a shift in funder priorities, and was just wondering what the thought process was from your end, because it was such a big change. Were you like, are you kidding me? Or no, we've got this, like, let's do it. And kind of what the timeline was. Did they just tell you real time, we want you to go here, or was it a back and forth? So.
I think, which case are you talking about, I guess, in terms of?
When you were saying, like, we really want you to move towards, they said workforce development the technology interventions.
No, so I think that was our own, sort of our own doing. I don't know if I'll make it back there in time, but part of this, this was designed to do sort of an impedance match between what we were seeing. So I had many years of working within NSF Science and Technology Center, with NSF-funded computer science research and things like that. And so I was aware of some of the priorities, particularly of the agency in the previous administration, and then what we thought were the sort of economic and workforce-related arguments to fund this area. And so that was really our pivot to say, wait a second, something you need to think about, because we had been making, for many years, the fundamental discovery area, that it's important to think about human creativity as part of fundamental scientific research in these areas, and I think, which is good, but I think one of the things that I learned through more time with those funders and more time looking at the larger scale investments, the sort of 160 million over 10 years kind of things that NSF was looking at the time, those were really driven by economic arguments that could sustain scrutiny in the legislature. And so those were things that we picked that seemed reasonable. We did have some workshops that I think the feedback, particularly from the folks that were working in indigenous ways of working, that competitiveness was not competition wasn't really a frame that they wanted to work in. But at the funding level, that was something that was very, very helpful. And so we're still sort of thinking about it in those terms. But yeah, I would say it was more a pivot that we recognized as a way to frame the value of the work than something that had been directly imposed. We just kind of inferred it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff.